Presentation by Annemarie Steidl within the Center Austria New Orleans context. I'm very glad Annemarie agreed to speak today on Zoom. My name is Günther Bischoff. I'm the director of Center Austria at the University of New Orleans. And Annemarie has visited us before, I think even a couple times, and talked about this subject matter. So she is well acquainted with us, and we said it's a pity we can't take her out to dinner here in New Orleans, but we'll do that later when we all can travel again, when these times will be over. So thank you everybody from the audience around the world for participating in Annemarie Steidl's talk. And I'm not going to talk too long about her many accomplishments. I'll just mention the fact that she is an associate professor at the Institute of Social and Economic History at the University of Vienna. I think she's also the chair of the department now. This is a huge institute, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, with like more than half a dozen professors and many researchers in the institute. So her boss, Josef Ehmer, was a very accomplished migration historian, now retired at the University of Vienna and the same institute. Really, I should say her mentor, Josef Ehmer, because he instigated the research projects with the Austrian Science Fund that have allowed Annemarie to work on the subject matter of migration. And she has produced many works. Of course, her latest work is what's in the German-speaking land called her Habilitationsschrift, which was just published in English by Purdue University Press on many routes. A very impressive book. I'm reading it right now. Very detailed, lots of tables, a classic work of social history in that sense. I've actually been involved with Annemarie and her migration studies for a while, and years ago, she published a book in a series that I've put together with the Studienverlag in Innsbruck. The book is From a Multiethnic Empire to a Nation of Nations, Austro-Hungarian Migrants in the US, 1870 to 1940. A very important work that she published together with Wladimir Fischer, Nebmeyer, and William Oberly. So that's the title with a very cute cover from a Czech cartoon. So she has been working on this subject matter for a long time, and recently I discovered an interview with Josef Ehmer in the Wiener Zeitschrift für Geschichte der Neuzeit, which is very thorough in explaining the larger context of migration studies. Sort of, if you will, the methodology that Annemarie has applied in her research too. And I hope she'll talk a little bit about the kind of quantitative work and statistical work and ship work that she has been doing for this study. So thank you very much again, Annemarie, for making this presentation. We will try to hold the whole session to about an hour. So if you can make a presentation, 20, 30 minutes about the main theses of this book, and then we'll open it up for the audience to ask questions. So Dr. Steidl, please.
Thank you, Günther. And I'm now going to share my screen with you. So I hope that this is going to work. Okay, where is it? It should be here. Okay, here we are. Okay, can you now see the screen?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So this is the book I'm going to talk about, and I didn't take this picture. It was actually taken by the graphic guys from Purdue University Press, but since they sent me the picture, so they really took the book out into the wilderness and took a picture of it. So, and there's also a blog if you want to read more about it. So there's at the bottom of that picture, you can see the internet address of the book. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna give you a lot of examples, which are part of the book, what the book is about. So the book explores the dynamics of internal European and transatlantic migration, as well as the connection. So what I'm mostly interested in are the connection between these different patterns, and links overseas migration, transatlantic migration, to the broader movement of Central Europeans from the middle of the century to the first decade of the 20th century, just until World War I. Let me start with giving you an example of a very early age of this migration. Okay, here we are. What you see here in the middle is an old postcard of the church of the village of Chopra Now. And I choose this example because Chopra Now is very close to Mellau, where Günther Bischof is born. So in honor of Günther, also because we do have this data for this small village. So according to the first population census in 1869, Chopra Now, which is in the Bregenzer Wald in Vorarlberg, this is the most western part of the Habsburg Empire at that time, had less than 500 inhabitants. But even so, between 1840 and 1860, at least 40 people left Chopra Now, and they also left the province of Vorarlberg. And most of these people actually choose to go to the north of France. And why went to the north of France? It's actually that since the late 17th century, we find mostly men, so it's a man movement of highly skilled construction workers from the Bregenzer Wald and also from the Montafon, who went west and north, mostly on a seasonal basis, as construction workers to build churches, monasteries, and castles. And this movement, mostly seasonal movement, existed since the 17th century up to the 19th century. And then we have people from this area who went to Switzerland. In that case, 5 persons left. We don't know, according to the sources, if these are men or women, but there was a long connection from the area of Vorarlberg to Switzerland as an integrated textile region. So there was a lot of linen production, and later on also cotton, and even until nowadays, a lot of textile production in nowadays Austria is based in Vorarlberg. We have 4 people leaving to the Rhineland in the German Empire, 1 to Bavaria, and 7 people stayed within the monarchy or the empire. 6 of them went to Vienna and 1 to Hungary. And then we have these 6 people leaving already to the United States of America in the first half of the 19th century. And these people went via French ports, so mostly via Cherbourg. They followed more or less the connections they already had to France via these construction workers, which existed since centuries. And there they got the information that there are new possibilities in the US, and then they followed these routes via French ports. So this is the start of that overseas migration. But as you see, even in such a small community like Chopra Now, people had a variety of destinations where they could choose where to go. And this is what I'm focusing on in the book later on. So let me just give you some numbers. It was Leslie Page-Moch who said in one of her, she did a review on my manuscript, and she said some questions can only be answered by numbers. So until the 1920s, so from the early 18th century onwards, it's assumed that about 60 million Europeans left overseas, many of them to the United States of America or the former American colonies, but not just to the US. So there were also people going to South America. But all in all, it's up to 60 million. From the late 19th century, so from the 1870s onwards up to the First World War, it's more than 3 million people who left the Habsburg Empire, mainly for the US. So it's up to 90% who choose to go to the United States. These people were the biggest group of migrants arriving in the US from 1902 to 1910. So when you put all these different ethnicities from the monarchy together, all these different groups, they actually were a bigger group than people coming from southern Italy, for example. So, but even so, when we see all these transatlantic movements, movements from Eastern and Southern to Central and Western Europe were about 4 times as high. So there was a lot more movement going on within Europe while these people went overseas. So next number from the in the same period, so from the 1870s to the First World War, only 1/3 of all internationally mobile Poles, for example, left for the US. Most others moved within Europe, and most others meaning they moved to the German Empire. No? From the Habsburg Empire, at least 5 million people, which is nearly 10% of the population in 1910, migrated internationally. So 10% of the population of the empire migrated internationally, most of them within Europe, and some of them going overseas to the US. So why focus in that book on the Habsburg Empire? So for a long time, when we look at migration studies, we have a nation-state focus. And to overcome that nation-state focus, the Habsburg Empire is actually quite a good example, because it consists, at least from the 1870s onwards, of 2 different political entities, so the Imperial Austria and the Hungarian Kingdom, and they have different migration policies and practices. So this gives me a possibility to compare at least 2 different sort of state entities, even if they share some structures together, like the foreign policy or the military. But when it comes to migration, the Hungarian government followed a different road than the Austrians. The Habsburg Empire presents a vast territory within Europe with lots of different ethno-linguistic or ethno-religious groups within it. So we have various languages, at least 10 official languages and a lot of others. We have various religious denominations. We have a high rate of Jewish people living in the empire. And what's also important, we have very different economic developments. So while some part of the empire had a highly industrialization phase, like for example, the textile region of Vorarlberg, or the northwestern part of Bohemia, other regions were nearly not touched by industrialization until the First World War. So this gives me the possibility to compare different ethnic groups, different religious groups, different economic developments, and have a look at how migration patterns interacted and were developed in these different areas of the monarchy. And now I want to show you, just to give you an idea, so that's a map of the empire. So we see the political districts of Imperial Austria, and we see the counties, or in Hungarian comitate, of the Hungarian part of the Hungarian kingdom. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you 3 different maps now. And they are standing for the 3 different chapters of the book. So I have a chapter which is mainly focusing on internal migration. And what you see in that map is the internal net migration within Imperial Austria and within the Hungarian kingdom. So what you not see in that map is that people moving from one part of the empire to the other. I'm just focusing on from one political district within Imperial Austria and from one county to the other within the Hungarian kingdom. And as you can see, there are areas which are highly connected via migration, and there are others where there is hardly any internal movement. So we have centers, as I already mentioned, the most developed, industrially developed centers, which have been spots of very high in-migration rates, like the north part of Bohemia. So the redder it gets, the more migrants are moving there. The Prague, Budapest as a center, Vienna and its surroundings, the northern part of Styria, and then quite interesting, the littoral or the Istrian Peninsula, with so this red spot that you see is the political district of Pula, and the reason why it is one of the hot spots of in-migration in 19. So this is all based on 1910, and the reason for that is that the Habsburg Navy is based there. So this was the main war harbor, as it is, Kriegshafen, as it is called in German. And there were soldiers from all over the monarchy stationed there, and that's the reason why it's shining in that dark red on that map. So this map is based on the census of the Habsburg monarchy, and this gives me the idea. So the approach of that book is a highly quantitative one. So you should not be afraid of numbers when you read that book, because there are a lot of numbers in that book. So using that numbers to show migration gives me a lot of possibilities to focus on the whole territory of the empire. But we also have to keep in mind that statistics only can tell us some story, but a lot of other migration is not touched in these statistics. So it only gives numbers of those people who are leaving a political district and move into another political district. But and the other backlash of a census is that the numbers were taken at the end of each year on December 31st. So a lot of seasonal migrants who are moving over the summer times are not counted within that census. The next chapter of the book focuses on these very important mostly seasonal migration from the Habsburg Empire to the German Reich. And this map is actually, I haven't done that. So this is done by Heinrich Rauchberg, a contemporary statistician who published it in 1889. The numbers are from 1885. So, but what we see is that there is, especially at the border regions, but all over the German Reich, we find migrants from Austria-Hungary. We have to keep in mind that the German Empire, after the United States, was the most important nation or empire who imported migrants from abroad, according to numbers. And this was mostly Poles from Galicia who moved to the German Empire on a seasonal basis because they had to leave the country at the end of each year. And it was also a lot of Bohemians who also had a long tradition of moving, the so-called Sachsengängerei. Many Bohemians moved to the German Empire at that time to work as miners, for example. So not just in agriculture as the Polish, as the Galician Poles, or later on in the beginning of the 20th century, it was mostly Ukrainians from the Galician province who moved to Germany. But this was a seasonal migration and not permanent. So they went as labor migrants, either in the industry or in agriculture, and left. And there were also a lot of women involved, for example, working in sugar beets. So there were whole gangs of women moving together as a group during harvest time. So, and now I'm coming to the migration of the Habsburg monarchy overseas. And what you see here is a completely different picture than what I presented at the beginning with that story from Chopra Now. No? These Chopra Now migrants already left at the first half of the 19th century, but this is now a map according to ship passenger lists. So the basis for that is ship passenger lists for Imperial Austria, and for the Hungarians, it's based, so the Hungarian statisticians were much more interested in getting numbers of overseas migration, and they published a volume on that migration. So the numbers for the Hungarians are based on that volume. Vándorlás, Vándorlás in Hungarian. It's quite interesting that the Hungarian term for migration is very much that of the German word. And you see a completely different pictures that what we have seen at the beginning, at the first half of the 19th century, because when you look at the far west of that map, you see the province of Vorarlberg, and there is not a lot of US migration going on at that time, because these people already left earlier. Some of them still went, but in comparison to what was going on in the western part of Galicia, and this is the area around Krakow. So this was the hotspot of US migration in 1910. So it's over 60% Polish speakers, many Jews. And then if you look into Hungary, it's what's nowadays Slovakia. So the Slovaks. So we can see that even if there is a border within the monarchy, these people were part of more or less a migration region at that time. So this is the province of Novi Sad Neumarkt in German, where in 1910 most people left. And then we see also that in the southern part of Hungary, there are many comitats or counties with a high overseas migration. So the Slovak-speaking people, Slovenes, Croats, and Serbs were the ones who joined other Slavic-speaking people moving overseas in 1910. What I'm not going to present, so the next chapter in the book is actually dealing with how these different migration patterns that I just showed you are entangled with each other, are embedded with each other. So how do they influence each other? And for that, I did a thorough statistical analysis with regression analysis, but I'm not going to present the regression analysis now because this is not that much fun to listen to it. And it's really a lot of numbers, but I can just briefly tell you the results of it. So for Imperial Austria, if you do a regression, the result is that the more people are moving overseas, the less they are moving internally. So we have alternatives. So we have regions where people are going overseas, and on the other hand, we have regions where people decide either to stay in the monarchy, move, say, from southern parts of Bohemia or Moravia to Vienna and its surroundings, or moving from special areas of Galicia to the German Reich, but not going overseas. For Hungary, we have another result. When I did the regression for Hungary, we see that international migration within Europe and internal migration complements overseas migration. So the more people are going overseas, the more people are also moving within the empire, or moving, especially for, say, Transylvania, moving to Romania. This is not always easy to interpret, but as we can see with all these numbers, that there are a variety of interconnectedness within these different regions. And this is what more or less fascinates me, where I worked on the topic for such a long time. Okay, let me show you. Come on. Okay, here. So we have all these binaries in migration research, and some of them still exist, and a lot of work has been done over the last 30, 40 years to overcome these binaries, but there's still a lot of studies: forced versus voluntary migration, temporary or seasonal versus permanent migration, and so on. But my focus in that book is mainly on internal or local versus international or global migrations. And what I'm trying to show is this connection between these two. The more people are connected with other regions, the more migration is going on, the more they get information about new opportunities overseas. And how much time do I still have? I don't see the clock on my, so I do have a few more minutes. So I just want to give you two more examples about that interconnectedness, or about how we find regions where everybody is going overseas, or other areas where people choose either to go overseas or stay within Europe. As for example, this is based on a survey done by the Polish Catholic Church in 1907 for the region of Tarnów diocese, because the Catholic Church, the Bohemian Catholic Church, was highly interested in where are all these people going. And I said at the beginning, there are at least 2 million Poles who went overseas, and but this is just part of one story, because if you look at these deaneries in the Tarnów diocese, you see that people had a variety of possibilities. Transatlantic means mainly going to the United States, but not just. So there were also Poles going to Brasilia, to Argentina, to Canada. But we find deaneries like Czechów and Waco, where half of the migrants went overseas and the other half left, but they stayed within Europe. They left to the German Empire, but not just. They went to France, they went to Denmark, Sweden even, and also they went to Hungary. So there were also Hungarian, so Hungary also needed agricultural labor, and they hired them in Galicia. And then we find deaneries like Radwów, where nearly everybody, 93.3% of these more than 3,000 people who left from that deanery, stayed within Europe, and we find Wielopole, for example, where also more than 1,000 people left and 99.8% went overseas. So it's that connections and entangledness of these different migration routes that's the contents of the book, and that's what was the most interesting point for me when doing this study. Last example. Okay, can you go on? Yeah, here we are. So this is an example from the very east of the monarchy. We started with the very west with Vorarlberg. Now we are in the far east, which is nowadays Romania, Transylvania in 1910, the political district of Mureș-Turda with the city of Târgu Mureș. So that's the Romanian names of this area now. And we have a lot of movement going on there, but most of the people went to the neighboring districts in Transylvania. So 83.9% of all the people that were recorded in the population census as being migrants moved to a neighboring district. So what we see also in the statistics is that most migration happened within one region, and only some migration went over longer distances. And in that case, from Mureș-Turda, they either went to the US, as many others did, or they went to Romania. In fact, from the rural area of Mureș-Turda, it's a little bit more people who went to Romania than those who went overseas. It's a little bit different for the city of Târgu Mureș, where most people, even it's a small number of those who left, but 67% of those went to the US, and some of them went to Romania. As I already said, women are also part of it, and most of these women went as domestic servants to Bucharest. So there was a migration from in this eastern part who went south and not north, because normally we look at European migration from the south to the north, but in special areas of the empire, we also have a movement from the north to the south. Okay, what are the results of that studies? Migration patterns, traditional and new paths within and beyond state borders in one direction or back and forth were highly entangled with each other. No? They were either alternatives or they were complementary to internal moves and international moves. And in my opinion, focusing on just one type of migration, so overseas migration, for example, is an exclusion of all the others, and we get only part of the whole story. So I think it's highly important to look at the whole pictures to understand why people have decided to go overseas or to go to the German Reich, or even to move to Bucharest in Romania at that time. Transatlantic migration did not take place in a vacuum. There's a long tradition of migration paths that existed, as for example, these construction workers from Chopra Now showed since the 17th century they moved, and these paths to the Americas emerged as a new option in context of these previously established migration strategies that people had. No? We have new ways of moving, railroads, steamships like the one which I have in the back. We have new communication possibilities. Letters were sent, so this made it possible for a lot of people going overseas, but this was not, this has to be seen as part of an overall high mobility within Central Europe. Okay, at the end, I want to thank to a lot of colleagues and friends who supported me over many years that I was working on that book. Some of these friends are here, like Josef Ehmer. thank you for supporting my academic career for such a long time. Günther Bischoff, thank you for organizing that book launch. I saw Donna Gabacha, who gave me many comments on the manuscript. I don't know who else is here, so I want to thank especially Brooke Benalotza-Batzak and Heidi Lelis, who helped me with putting that book into a proper English so that it is also readable and not just numbers. Thanks for the publishers who made it possible. Thanks to Howard Lawton from the Center for Austrian Studies in Minneapolis that I could integrate that manuscript into the book series Central European Studies. I got financial support from the German Research Fund, from the Austrian Research Fund. For the book printing, I got support from Vienna University. I think I have forgotten a lot of others, but in the name of all of them, thank you for, and thanks to all my friends who are listening in, that they have encouraged me to finish the book. Okay, I think that's it.
Okay.
I'm going to stop the PowerPoint now.
Okay, thank you, Annemarie, for a fascinating talk. Let me just make a few comments, and not surprisingly, I'm going to start with Chopra Now. Thank you for bringing that example. You know, if you dig a little deeper, I mean, you said at one point, you know, there is more to migration than just statistics. There is individuals too. And Chopra Now is actually famous for Franz Michel Filder, a writer who stayed at home and tried to reform this very rural society along socialist ideas, and was not very popular there. But there is people like, you know, among the six, I assume, who went to the United States, like the Kohler family from Chopra Now. And the Kohlers, of course, are still a very prominent family in Wisconsin, where they eventually settled and built a business that essentially is building all kinds of toilet bowls and bathtubs. I say, you can't really pee in the United States without peeing into a
I know.
So some of you might, Kohler. That's a prominent family that left Chopra Now and really did very well. And if you talk about the construction workers who went to France, of course, that's related to the so-called Baroque Baumeister, who you don't mention. These are essentially church builders from the area, Chopra Now architects who built many famous Baroque churches, like in Einsiedeln, Switzerland, or Weingarten, Germany. And they usually took their workers along because there's a long tradition of great Handwerker coming from the Brinkserwald, particularly working with woodwork. Maybe this is the most interesting parts of your book. I found that you deal a lot with gender issues, that you say all these mates and so forth that migrated are often forgotten by migration historians. I think that's an important part of the book. And the most interesting example you mentioned there is, I think, Slovenian mates who go to Egypt, to Cairo. And then what was visible in your spatial distribution map is another very fascinating aspect of your story. And that is, if you look at that map around Budapest, the central part, Hungary, is white. People don't move a lot because the Hungarian kingdom wanted to Magyarize the kingdom by keeping the Magyars at home, but by welcoming Slovaks and Croats and so forth, leaving the kingdom and migrating. So essentially it would become a more Magyar place. Sort of reminds me a bit of current Hungarian policies too, meaning this has a long tradition, this Magyarization your book suggests. And finally, a question on the Poles. When you talk about Poles, of course, you talk about Poland not being in existence in 1870 to World War I, and you talk about 3 million Poles leaving. So are you counting the Jews from Galicia amongst those Poles, or are you speaking about ethnic Poles, which of course still exist and leave for America and Germany and so forth.
So these numbers that what I'm talking about, I think it was 2 million Poles. This is covering all Polish speakers. So they are not the Jewish involved. So, and it's not just the Galician Poles.
Okay.
I do have, there are more numbers. So I do have the exact numbers, especially for 1910, of really Polish speaking people leaving Galicia. I mean, this is the problem of when you are dealing with administrative data and official statistics, there are always flaws in how these people are counted. And it's hard to, especially when you look at the Jews, it's really hard to make comparison about what the US administration is counting as a Jew versus what the Austrian administration is counting. Now, and then the Hungarian administration is counting it even differently because the Austrians are counting religion. They are not counting, Yiddish is not an official language. The problem is that most of these people were bilingual, but when it comes to the census, they had to give one language. So, so this ethnic classification is a highly complicated thing. I'm talking about that in the book, but I don't have a real solution for that problem. Because at the end, yeah, you would have to give up using that statistic at all. So you can use them, but then you have to explain what is the problem with it. So you have to be highly critical with all these documents and sources my tables and graphs are based on. And thanks for mentioning these Baroque construction workers from Vorarlberg. These are actually new to me. I know the color, I mean, there are not just numbers in the book. There are some individual stories of individual people, and one of them is this story of the Kohler family, because there's a lot of material where you can follow these people.
Thank you very much. I'm going to roll it over to Christian so he can ask our very big audience to ask questions. Christian.
Thank you, Professor Steidl, for this great talk. And yeah, if anyone has questions, please just post them in the chat, and I will call on you to unmute yourself. And just for those who haven't seen the warning, we're recording the lecture for people who couldn't make it today. So if you don't want to show up on the recording, please just keep your video off. Okay, we have a question from Robert Dupont. Dr. Dupont, do you want to pose your question yourself, or should I read it out?
It's a simple one. I just wanted to know if you came across any instances of US states actually advertising in these areas to encourage immigration.
No, not the United States advertising. It's mainly, so there's a lot of advertising about moving overseas, but this is done by agencies which are connected with the shipping lines. So the especially in Galicia, it's mainly the Missler agency who sells tickets, gives information, organizes trips overseas. But this is mainly done from the shipping lines for when companies, according to the Foreign Act from 1885, companies were not allowed to, so US companies were not allowed to hire workers overseas. So I didn't find any material that that US states advertised.
Thank you.
I see a question from Maria Stella. Can I just do you wanna ask it, or then you have to turn on your microphone. Okay, let me just see. I don't see the question anymore. It popped up on my screen.
How do you, she asked, how do you connect in your book the general perspective and single stories?
That's not an easy question. So there are some single stories, but not many. And so the single stories are mainly examples that are given for the overall perspective. Now, like, for example, the Kohler family, or I have an example of a young Hungarian woman who has been detained in Ellis Island because her fiancé didn't show up. So I have such short individual stories which are interwoven with the broader picture. But so the main focus of the book is on the overall pictures, and it's a quantitative approach. But I think it's these individual stories at one point make it more readable.
I have to apologize. That was actually somebody else's question.
But that's not a problem. I think Maria Stella, can you repeat your question?
We still don't hear you. She asked, did the state encourage transatlantic emigration from poor regions?
That's also not that easy to, because it's, there's a difference between the Hungarian kingdom and the Imperial Austria. No? Günther Bischof just mentioned it. No? The Hungarian kingdom, right from its independent government after the Austrian Compromise in 1867, started a policy of Magyarization. So they closed the schools for Slovak speakers, and they didn't hinder Slovaks and also Croats to move overseas, while they actually did not encourage Hungarians to move. And especially at the beginning of the 20th century, they invited Hungarians to come back, and not the Slovaks, because they really wanted to raise the number of Hungarians. So they wanted to create a more homogeneous Hungarian nation state. And so it wasn't really that they promoted, but in some ways, Slovaks were encouraged to move. And they also kept numbers about people coming back. So they wanted the Hungarians. So return migration is also an important topic in that book. I didn't speak about it in the presentation, but in the early 20th century, it's up to 40% of these people who went overseas who came back. So it's mostly a temporary labor migration for many of these people. And there are some assumptions that if it wouldn't have been the First World War, even more people would have come back, but that we don't know. the Hungarian state encouraged Hungarian speakers to come back, but not Slovaks or Croats. They could stay overseas. For Austria, it's actually, there's a long discussion of the Austrian administration how to interact with these overseas migration. And there are some people who think it's a positive development, because if you look at the remittances, so these people send really millions of crowns back to the monarchy. So it's there are some estimates, not that many studies on these remittances, but also these people who came back after a few years in the US, they brought so-called pocket remittances. So they brought back what they could save by working in the industry in the US and invested it in Europe. So it was on one point a positive development for the economy in Imperial Austria. But on the other hand, there were a lot of people arguing against emigration or going overseas to the US because they were afraid of losing too many cheap laborers. Imperial Austria never had a migration law. So there was a lot of discussion about that at the end of the century, beginning of the 20th century, but they never agreed on either encouraging or hindering people to go overseas.
Maybe I can jump in. Annemarie, there is two questions, larger questions. One by Donna Gebaccia and Mihat Sobek, who are wondering about chain migration, whether your research can explain chain migrations like your data from Poland. Mihat Sobek suggests that. And then we have two questions about sources. Tamara Scheer would like you to talk about collections of autobiographies in the United States that researchers could use. And Britta McEwen asks you whether you would like to tell a story about your absolute favorite source that you found. So we have a few minutes left. If you could answer those two.
Yeah. Hi, Donna. I don't see you, but I know that you are listening. So this is really nice that you took the time to listen to that talk. Chain migration is actually something that I cannot follow with my data because all the graphs and tables and my argumentation is based on 1910. So on the 1910 census of Hungary and of Imperial Austria, and also I have a database with these transatlantic ship passenger manifests from the National Archive in New York. It's more or less the same data that you can use at Ellis Island. But since this is all data from 1910, I cannot really follow migration chains. We only can, this is only based on secondary literature when I'm talking about that. But my sources don't give information on that, which is, I would love to, but it would cost me a lot more. So it would have been an immensely lot more of work because for getting really to migration chains, I would have to link these people, and linking databases is still something that's taking really a lot of work. Tamara asked about the sources. I more or less said the main sources. So the analysis is mainly based on these population census is from 1910. I also looked at the population census of 1910 from the United States, but this was more or less the other book that Peter showed at the beginning, where we did a more detailed analysis of these migrants who already were in the US, according to the US Census. And then I had some local and regional surveys, like, for example, the church survey from the Polish Catholic Church, which they did in 1907. And then I also used some regional and provincial data, for example, for Bohemia. So the Bohemians right before the First World War, they started to collect data on seasonal migrants. And the idea was to do a more thorough analysis of the seasonal migration out of Bohemia. But yeah, then the First World War started and the project was not really taking action. So they stopped it. But there is some data on that, and this is quite fascinating because, yeah, they talk a lot about where these people went, what these people did, as detailed as that from some regions they were musicians who moved all over Europe. They talk about glass blowers, construction workers, and also hop pickers. So this is also quite fascinating that there are a lot of Bohemians from one region in Bohemia who went to Bavarian hop fields to pick hops. Yeah, this is also answering the question from Britta. This is probably the most fascinating material besides all these numbers, where you get a little bit of an idea, not that these people are moving, but what are they doing when they move and where do they go? Because from the census, you just get the sheer numbers and you get an idea that they are going to another country, but not explaining to which regions they are going. And you don't get any information what the people actually really were doing when going to, for example, Romania. No? Was this?
Okay, I think, Annemarie, I'm a firm believer in staying within an hour in these Zoom sessions, so not to create too much Zoom fatigue. So I would say let's close it at this. If people still have questions for you, they should contact you directly. You're easily to be found in the Institute of Social and Economic History at the University of Vienna. Thank you so much for a fascinating talk, and thank you to the audience for listening in. And if anything with such a book launch is accomplished, it hopefully is that Annemarie raised your interest enough where you're going to take a look at the book yourself. It is available now through Purdue University Press, and it deserves a rich readership. So thank you all for participating, and thank you, Annemarie, for doing this through the Center Austria New Orleans auspices. We appreciate.
Thank you, Günther, for this nice invitation, and thank you, Christian, for taking care of the technique and making this possible. Thanks a lot, and yeah, have a nice lunch in New Orleans, I would say.
It is lunchtime. You're right. Okay, thank you. Take care.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.